I met Boz ages ago. I mean, through my sister, a really long time ago. And then I heard her speaking. I told you guys at the Paul Holdengraber podcast I was listening to, and she gave a really great interview then. And I reached out just because of what we're trying, how we're rethinking our programming, and especially around ideas around abolition and decolonization and the Exodus workshop. I mean, I've shared with Boz some of our current statements and where we are with things, but I kind of want to give both Paul and Lawrence a chance to just give you a little bit of a background of what we've been doing. And we wanted to just learn from you and hear from you about working with this community, and you have traveled to so many prisons all over the world, and how can we envision kind of trying to figure out liberatory practices with with being able to work with this community, and is there a way that we can do that where we are upstate, and through what we're trying to the different kind of resources we have to offer. So I think Lawrence and Paul, do you want to add anything to get the conversation going right now?
I had several questions for you, Boz, but I'm not sure. Yeah, what I can add to what Julie said. Only that you know, we began as a sort of a collective of you know, mostly queer artists, writers, architects of color. We had this campus in upstate New York. We were always sort of invested in doing, you know, working at the intersections of art making, education, and agriculture. And I think that, you know, the project has sort of in different phases emphasized different aspects of it. We're also sort of in the territory of the Bard Prison initiative. So Woodburn Correctional Facility is just 15 minutes from our campus. And I've, as a postdoc, I taught in a prison education program further upstate in, I forget the county, Oneida County. Yeah.
And one of the other things that I would just like to talk about, one of the reasons that we want to really push a little bit further in trying to understand this, how to kind of work with this community, engage with this community, is that one of the guiding kind of projects, that the Exodus project, which Paul conceptualized as part, and which we've really kind of taken on for Denison Hill, and is really thinking about the kind of emancipation and post-slavery moment, and so really kind of the interrogation of enslaved people and the history of slavery, and the kind of contemporary slavery and enslavement, and how do we really engage with thinking around these ideas, but especially around the land and food equity. And so I think a lot of this, all of these are kind of the bigger issues that we're thinking about, but we have different ways that we want to really develop and broaden our outreach within the communities that are up there. And we're trying to really investigate how and who those are, you know? And so one of the reasons and because of that, and because of your long experience with that community, that's one of the, that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation between the three of us and you.
Right.
Yeah, maybe if I can ask you a question that ties all of these things together, rather than asking you to sort of just you know, stump and say something interesting, is you know, I'm really curious, right? If I understand the chronology right correctly, then you did the research for incarcerated nations before you started the prison to college pipeline?
No, yeah. I actually, I mean, I could talk a little bit about the general trajectory of the work and kind of maybe offer some kind of general thoughts on what it means to build programs, based on my own experience of building one. And also now my work with Incarceration Nations Network in terms of looking at quote successful programs and what they look like and what their aspects of them are that I think are really important. I mean, I got my entire education in mass incarceration and anything related to justice by being in the trenches and doing the work, for more than a decade of building the prison to college pipeline. And I came to building it in some ways, like I sort of fell into it. I don't come from a background of criminology or anything like that. I started volunteering as an educator in prisons because I was getting a lot of letters from people in prison. And although I grew up in New York, in the Bronx, in the 80s and 90s, which was the era of the ramping up of mass incarceration. I'm not directly impacted, and I don't have family members in prison. But I was doing a lot of writing through the arts, really, as a culture writer, about the culture of race in America. And so it's impossible to write about the culture of race in America without touching on criminal justice, given, what this country is founded on, white supremacy and criminalizing of Blackness and otherness and all that. So anyway, long story short, I was just getting a lot of letters from people in prison, and one of them invited me to come inside and give a talk, which I did. It was a Latino group that were just trying to bring brain power to, from the outside in to engage with them because they were hungry for intellectual engagement, which people in prison are because there's so little given to them, even with all of the college programs like Bard's, excellent program. And so that led to my just going in often with this group and doing talks, learning a lot from its founder, who's still incarcerated, and also bringing other people. I would just kind of bring colleagues and friends in to do talks and be part of their luncheons. And so I ultimately formalized that by starting the Prison to College pipeline. And I really did.
That was like 2007, 2000.
I started volunteering in about, I guess it was 2006.
I think 2006, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And then, and the Prison to College pipeline I started planning in 2010. And, we launched in 2011. And we launched tiny, which is one of the lessons I learned, just get it off the ground, just do it, even if it's 14 people, which it was. And it wasn't even a program. I called it a program. It was a class, it was accredited class from John Jay. But we started on some shoestring budget and we did it. And then we built out from there. And now, the program, it's been impacted by COVID as far as recruitment for this year. We would have been bigger, but, every year we would just incrementally add students and add elements to the program and build it out. But I started really it was founded, and this I think of a lot as I work in international contexts, collaborating with folks to build versions of the Prison to College pipeline there. I never think of it as like a prescription model, that you can just cut and paste and replicate, but rather it's really a philosophy. And the philosophy is that there is a role for universities to play in, prisons and in justice systems over and above education around these issues, but that there's a role that a partnership between a prison and a university is a valuable thing, whatever it looks like, however it can look, and it can look lots of different kinds of ways. The other main piece of the philosophy of Prison to College pipeline that I think is also applicable very broadly when we talk about doing work in prisons is that anything you do on the inside must continue on the outside. And a lot of programs don't do that. And while that when you begin doing the work with folks on the inside, that has to continue over to working with them on the outside, and hence this idea of the pipeline.
Right.
And while now more programs do work with their students when they come home, at the time when I founded Prison to College Pipeline, there wasn't much of that at all. It was, we educate you while you're inside, which is great. And I'm not knocking, this isn't a knock on any of that, because often people are doing this work in prisons, are doing it with low bandwidth and such. And so you do what you can do. Any program is welcome. But in an ideal world, that shouldn't happen. You really have to, because you got to recognize that folks are coming home, and the need, in some ways, the need is easily just as great, and in some respects even greater, given the crisis of reentry. So the idea being, we wouldn't just be offering education, we'd also be focusing on people when they come home. And
reentry seems to be a big part of the community up there, from what I understand. Many people who are released and don't have anywhere to go and end up in Monticello and end up in some of the shelters around there. And so that is part of the community that we want to try and maybe do some form of outreach with. But it's almost hard to understand I think one of the questions that I keep having about our programming and how we're thinking about things is how could we, outside of conceptually, actually get engaged with the community, especially with the community farm that the community farm garden that I told you about, that we've been thinking about and are in the early stages of really conceptualizing and trying to formalize.
Yeah. So I think, yes, to working with folks who've come home. A lot of times when people envision doing work around prisons, they think about going inside. But in many ways, the need is even greater on the outside. And I will say personally that it's even harder work. They're both hard work. They're both emotionally grueling as well. And also hugely emotionally rewarding and, invigorating. But the great challenge is when people come home and it's one crisis after the next. So jobs, housing, trauma, family reconnections. It is also people, it's not just a one-shot deal. People have reentry crises that come and go and come and go. It's never, I've not seen almost anyone come home and it's just this one-shot trajectory, building life. There's a lot of ups and downs. And so thinking about the work that you guys do and thinking about a farm scenario, any job is a valuable job, but a job that is holistic, a job that also has healing properties to it, a job where the founders, the employer isn't just taking you reluctantly, but welcoming you and offering you, I hate these terms, but wraparound support, for what within that context of that job, and recognizing that you're coming from a place of trauma from likely before you were incarcerated and now on top of that incarceration, and supporting trauma-informed practices and healing in the context of the work is so important. It's not just about get a job, any old job, although for many people, they'll be happy to take that. And I'm often desperately looking for students for any old job. But the dream is to have a job where you have supportive employers and it's a collective. We've spoken about in the Incarceration Nations Network, which is a network of global change makers, people who do this work all over the world. We do have a farm that Second Chances Farm that I visited last month in Delaware, and they're staffed entirely by formerly incarcerated folks. And what impressed me most about them was that they really built a community for those folks. It wasn't just here's a job. And so it's more than just the practical, although the practical again is significant, right? This is a job that is sustainable, that there'll be a lot of need for, especially as we talk about food insecurity and so on. But that you're creating a circle of support and familyness in the workplace. I'm inspired by cooperative models, of course. To me, that's the real ideal, is create a scenario where folks have ownership and shared ownership and are a true community, have a stake in this entity.
Is that the case at the farm you were just talking about?
It isn't, no.
Circumstances?
It's not. I've seen it in other places. In Italy, there's a restaurant that is in a prison, actually, and is run as a cooperative with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated folks involved in it. In Argentina, one of our partners is a cooperative also. They train people in graphic design while in prison. And then when they come out, they have the opportunity to be part of that cooperative. So it's a shared ownership model. In Brazil, our partner, they're called Humanitas 360. They've built in women's prisons in Brazil these different cooperatives that, you know, again, the women are not just making stuff; they have a stake in it.
Right.
I mean, Latin America and Italy and Spain, you know, there's a real tradition of cooperatives, and that idea, which is very far into America, it's like they don't even know what a cooperative means. But to me, that's the only kind of real thing. There's also we have another partner in Peru. They're actually in Peru and Thailand working with women as well, incarcerated women who making sweaters. They're called Carcel. And she, through our conversations, is now trying to shift that model over to a cooperative model. Because I mean, when we think about labor practices in prison, obviously we're tapping into a legacy of slavery
Exploitation.
and indentured servitude and all kinds of, you know, the legacy, the white supremacist legacy of this country. So like, and often the conversation becomes no exploitative labor. But there is a way to think about doing this in a humane way. And to me, cooperatives are at the heart of that.
It's interesting because we've been talking a lot just in terms of even conceptualizing the agriculture program, and that's been part of the core of something that Lawrence has been very insistent on, which is the kind of moving away from any kind of, what did you call it, Lawrence? What was the earlier model? Sharecropping.
Sharecropping.
And that to some other model and that can actually deal with land equity and what farmers actually contribute to the land, and actually the history of farming being completely, you know, embedded in slavery, and, you know, kind of that model is what farmers basically do. And so like trying to move, I don't know, I think that's a super interesting way, something for us to think about, like in terms of how to conceptually kind of think about the agriculture program that we're doing. And I don't know, the cooperative model seems like a really interesting kind of direction for us to think about.
But then could you could you say more about that distinction between a kind of complete rejection of kind of labor practices versus a more humane?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's sort of, it's like there is something of a spectrum, you know, when we think about labor practices, period, but especially when we think about labor practices in the context of prison, you know, and on the one end of the spectrum is like evil modern day slavery. And that is like, when I think about the California firefighters in this moment, you know, like that everyone's like, oh my God, we don't have our prisons to supply us with free labor. You know, everything about that is just sickening. Like California is burning because you don't have a like slave labor force to pay 5 cents an hour so that you can, and then call them heroes when you've enslaved them. Like, so that is on that end. And pretty much everything that exists in the context of prisons is basically that. I mean, our DMVs are often staffed by phone centers that are in prisons, like all of this, and they're getting paid nothing, and it's, you know, it's ridiculous. You move up the scale and you get to like stuff that involves kind of job training, but still exploitation. And I think that's where a lot of folks will try to get off the hook with the labor practices and say, well, we're training them in jobs. Whole Foods was involved in a scandal recently, I think it was a couple of years ago, around their fish was from prisons, from fish like tilapia farms and prisons. And they said, oh, but we're training people. And Yeah, well, if you're training people, you know, the humane way to train people is pay them properly. And so leverage that with the prison authorities to say, we're not going to train them and pay your wages. We are going to pay them, you know, what you would get paid on the outside. So you start to move up the scale towards the more humane when you say, all right, like for instance, Carcel, the organization I just mentioned in Thailand and Peru with this, they're doing designer sweaters. They're very adamant about they pay their women, you know, really well, provide services to them, you know, treat them like it's good capitalism. It's kind capitalism. Similarly, on the outside, Second Chances Farm, I mean, if that's not an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
But Second Chances Farm is also a capitalist enterprise. So, you know, they're making money. They're also contributing to good while they do it. They're conscious about food security, and they're also very conscious about training their and offering support to their employees, their formerly incarcerated employees, around entrepreneurship development and training and support. And a lot of the folks that I met in Second Chances Farm were very interested in the marijuana industry and cannabis and thinking about the skills they're gaining and applying it to doing that and make, you know, so there's a lot of capitalism floating around there. Even it's not just this do-good enterprise. And then you start moving up the scale to a scenario that says, no, it's not enough to just treat you right, pay you right, train you, but you need to, like, it's actually not fair that any one person should own this company. In fact, we should all share it. We should all own it. And so if you're part of it, you have, you know, you are a part owner of it, and we collectively own this together. We all make the same, we all are subject to the same, you know, rules and regulations and so on. And like, that to me is the supreme, you know, way to do things.
And that exists.
It does. I mean, that it exists. The one that I saw in Italy, that restaurant, and it's one of the best restaurants in Milan, which is saying a lot. It's Milan,
What is the
you
name
know.
of the restaurant?
It's called Il Galato, which means in jail. I forget the spelling of it, but I can get it to you. The one, there's other, the one Humanitas 360, they're our partner in Brazil who's working with the women, also a cooperative. And I can tell you the name of the Argentinian one, our Argentinian partner as well. They're fantastic. I mean, what's interesting, they're called, they're called Co-op Esquina Libertad.
Co-op.
Esquina Libertad.
Do you mind sharing the link to that in the
chat?
Yeah,
I can share all those links.
And do you know if these were started, just out of curiosity? Go ahead, Lawrence, you want to go?
No, go ahead. I'll ask some question after.
Started by formerly incarcerated people, or like, how were some of these cooperatives, like who founded them in a way, or like,
yeah,
how did they support that? Like, how did they get off the ground?
So these ones that I mentioned are all supported by, they were started by non-formally incarcerated folks, by organizations. Again, predominantly in countries where there's a tradition of cooperatives, where there's a tradition of that movement. Italy has that legacy. Argentina has that legacy because there were so many Italian immigrants actually to Argentina. So there's that. There is one more cooperative I'm just learning about it myself. I had a conversation with them by phone. They're in Puerto Rico, and they're a very well-respected, kind of renowned co-op in prisons all over Puerto Rico that was actually started by people who were incarcerated. And they're doing a range of various things inside the prisons. And when I spoke to them the other week, and I'm planning to go see and visit.
Like a range of things like what?
They've got, a lot of them do crafts, or, you know, they produce things. They make things, like the Argentinian one makes notebooks, signs. They're, you know, graphic design, print, and design company. So the one in Brazil, I believe they're doing some kind of, also some sort of fashion product that the women are designing. The same in Puerto Rico. It's some sort of craft. And I think there's all kinds of, the Argentina one is really inspirational in that it's actually illegal. They found a loophole because it's illegal if you're in prison to be part of a cooperative. You're not legally allowed to be in a cooperative, to own something, to be a part owner. So you're technically not part of the cooperative while you're incarcerated, but you operate by all rules and regulations as if you are. And then when you come home, you can become officially part of it and have the job if you so choose. I really like how they did that. And again, I love that they have that same, what I was talking about earlier in terms of the inside outside component.
Yeah.
And how important that is. The same is true in Puerto Rico from the folks that I spoke to, that when they come home from prison, they continue to work in the cooperative. They don't have to, but they have the option to do that.
Yeah.
And remain part of it. Otherwise, they can leave the cooperative, and then there's space for new people to join it.
Can I ask you? I found it really striking that except for the one in Puerto Rico, which is at the peripheries of of the United States, that none of these cooperatives are in the U.S., and that it seems that when institutions become involved in some kind of prison reform initiative, right? Whether it's philanthropic organizations or universities, that it always seems to be at the there always seems to be this danger of the programs that we're doing, often using our own unpaid labor, are just a sort of like mask for the inhumanity of the prison, right? So that I'm when I taught or led this, we called it a book club. It was a really small initiative out of like a small liberal arts institution in upstate New York. There was always this sense that I don't know like what I'm actually giving you, right? The inmate, right? And that it really seems like the institution is actually gaining much more from any of these initiatives than the inmates themselves. And I'm just curious, like, well, I guess two things. One, why do you think we see so few attempts to collectivize or to create cooperatives in the United States? And two, how do how does, for instance, the prison to college pipeline, like, manage to negotiate that, like, that really kind of like ethical dilemma?
I'm really glad you asked that, because it's a really big ethical dilemma. And in a sense, the answer to your question is there's no way to negotiate it, but you have to acknowledge it, because we're not only, we're propping up the system, right? By providing services, quote unquote, to departments of corrections, whether it's an educational or whatever it is, volunteering in any capacity, book groups. Yes, we prop up the system and allow it to exist and allow them to look good. But it's a real ethical dilemma, because then what are you going to do? Say, well, in the name of that, sorry, incarcerated community everywhere, we won't, we're not going to, in the name of abolition, we're not going to provide things that are keeping you alive, literally, and sane. So I think we have to acknowledge it. I think we have to, constantly be negotiating it in our minds and recognizing the ways in which, I'm not going to lie, I no longer run the prison to college pipeline. I passed the torch primarily because it was necessary for the program to operate without me, but even more so, I wasn't in the country enough, and I wanted to really focus on Incarceration Nations Network and global work. But it starts to really wear on you. when you feel like you are working on the one hand, and I operate in a space of contradiction, which is on the one hand, work as an abolitionist, working to abolish a system, but also at the same time, not having the luxury to operate as an abolitionist, because right here and now, people are suffering and people, you know, have needs, and we need to provide these quote unquote band-aids. And I call them the kind of band-aid programs, including prison to college pipeline. I don't mean it in a derogatory way. It is a band-aid because, and so are all reentry programs and many diversion programs, because they're diverting people who shouldn't have been criminalized in the first place for laws that shouldn't exist in the first place. You know, we're educating people who should have been given a first chance at education so that they wouldn't have ended up in prison, most likely, right? If not for the systemic racism and inequality of our nation. We're providing reentry services to people who shouldn't have been locked up in the first place, again, if the systemic, you know, racism and inequality, and shouldn't have been locked up for that long as well. So it becomes this whole, like, you know, it's very frustrating, and it becomes very emotionally draining and intellectually exhausting. So there's no answer to it. But I just know that personally speaking, I could never, you know, I wish I had the luxury to really operate in a fully abolitionist space. I can't. I do the work on the ground. And I also see, like, I'll become very ignorant very quickly the minute I stop actually doing the work in the real, as opposed to just doing it from a theoretical perspective or from, you know, from the sidelines in some way. And then your question about the US and cooperative models, totally true. Although there are, I myself, this is a learning process for me too. I'm not an economist, and I know little about like cooperative economies. I'm super interested in them and continuously kind of obsessively learning more, not only in a prison context, but period, as an anti-capitalist. But I think fundamentally, Americans, even though there are a number of significant cooperatives that do exist in the US that I've just learned about, fundamentally, America is, you know, we are capitalism. We are the essence of it. And so the idea of like shared ownership or non-ownership is like alien to us. And, you know, I don't, from a theoretical perspective, I don't believe in ownership at all. Like, we shouldn't own, well, even, and frankly, spending a lot of time, I lived part-time in South Africa, or I did before COVID, and it, you know, there's a lot of talk about land and returning the land, and this is a big conversation, and that always struck me as really problematic. Like, what do you mean owning the land and returning land? I recognize that like outrageous amounts of you know, racist events have happened around stealing of land, but how do we move past that into a discourse of non-ownership or collective ownership, as opposed to like the whole, well, give it back conversation? I don't think America will ever fully get that notion. Like, we have you know, the indigenous tradition here certainly thinks very differently around these things. So it would take like some of that coming into a more mainstream conversation. Plus,
yeah, well, sorry, go ahead.
No, there's last thing. Plus, I think it's very tied to ideas about vengefulness too, and anger and rage, and feeling like you screwed us over. We want to take back what's ours. We want what's rightfully due to us. I want what's mine, you know. Which is an understandable feeling of rage, right, in the face of dramatic injustice.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying before about ownership, I think really speaks to, you know, a sort of like a resurgent attitude in you know, indigenous land trust and around like you know, land equity, that has to do with this idea that actually no one owns the land, even though we live in a country in which, you know, every square inch of soil is, you know, tied up in someone's pocket in some way. You know, and I think one of the things that we've been discussing is you know, how do you move to this model of land equity? How do you move to a more kind of like collective model, you know, even if, you know, the land has to be owned, right? There has to be a deed, you know. So, you know, I'm wondering, like, would it be possible to have a sort of like a community garden in which, you know, every member of the garden, you know, has some investment in that, you know, in that soil, in that patch that they're farming, right? Like maybe that could be like a way of like collectivizing
Yeah, for sure.
real
I
estate.
think that, I mean, I'm currently doing a lot of research on intentional communities for my next book, which is about building utopias and how we get there. And like, so I'm, you know, knee deep in that thought myself and learning about various intentional communities in the US and out, and how they've managed to create you know, a land deed that has every family listed on it. But I think even there's the larger question of why it doesn't have to be formalized. You know, technically one person can own the land, whatever that means for once you're operating within the confines of US law for those, you know, for the necessity of that. But the question is more about it's about thinking about a community as being not rights based, but obligation based, duty based. You know, like in America, all we do is talk about my rights, my rights, my rights. Really, what about your responsibilities,
Abilities.
you know, and duties, and like to each other, to the land, to like and so I think that's the basis on which this kind of thing starts.
Is there like I mean, in your search for suitable partners for prison to pipeline, to college pipeline, like, is there, I don't know, like a kind of a curriculum that you know, that's a basis for kind of bringing potential partners into like the space of this kind of conversation to like work out how, you know, like how you would work together?
Yeah, I mean, we, in the space of education, I think there's a lot of coalitions that do that in terms of education in prisons. You know, it's become, there's a long history to why this is, but in the back, you know, basically due to the 1994 crime bill that dear Joe Biden was a big part of, when elimination of financial aid came about for people in prison, that decimated college programs in 1994. And so there's been a slow rebuilding of them since then. And also since then, an enormous amount of community around that. So it's not us competing with each other, you know, but rather working together. Because even with all of us, the hundreds of college programs nationwide in prisons, there is still so much more need. We can never really meet the need. And the same is true actually about reentry programs. Like however many reentry programs there are, and there are, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of them nationwide and worldwide, there's still so much more that needs to be done. And it's, you know, and also there's again, I don't see the cooperative model. I don't see any really just stuff happening in the space of business. But so I think that there's a lot of community building among these networks, like statewide, citywide, nationwide. And what we do with Incarceration Nations Network is global, is really building coalition across national borders.
Do you think that in order for there to think of the cooperative model, that there has to be some kind of profit-driven enterprise in that? A lot of the way we've been thinking about what we're doing is more about kind of what can be taught, what can be learned, what can be kind of invested in the soil. And I'm just wondering, like, that we haven't really been thinking of the kind of a profit model structure for that community garden, but I'm wondering if that would be something that would, like,
yeah. See, I think that's,
or is that, you know, it's more just maybe
it's another sort of tricky piece of the puzzle, because on a very practical level, people coming home need money in their pocket.
Right.
You know, and so I've had a lot of people approach me in wanting partnership with Prison to College Pipeline, for instance, or whatever it is, who want to offer some kind of training or perhaps some kind of therapeutic, you know, program of some sort, or economic literacy, financial literacy, something like that. it's a very nice idea, but practically speaking, our students won't show up for it because their lives when they come home are bombarded with commitments, parole, like a lot of them, you know, really painful commitments that suck you dry. They suck your time dry, they suck your energy dry.
Right.
And so they don't, and this, I think that's actually a larger statement about what capitalism does to all of us, you know, but it's even felt even more intensely and acutely by folks coming home from prison, because they'll often come home and they'll think that they're coming home to freedom and they're coming home to capitalism, which means an endless amount of hours, you know, of work for too little pay. A lot of family responsibilities and sometimes making new families, you know, having children or whatever that looks like, having to keep those parole appointments. Just it's, you know, programs. Parole often requires people to go to anger management or some kind of drug treatment, whatever it is. It's like the laundry list of stuff.
Right.
What, even if you offer them something good, like, you know, that involves healing and is therapeutic, it's not gonna, it's just another thing on the time clock,
Right.
you know? So unfortunately, it's like it has to be tied into an economic model in order for it to allow for the therapeuticness of it to be enacted, you know, because otherwise it's, but that itself is a paradox and frustrating, because then you're having to buy into this capitalist model of putting money at the forefront. And it sucks.
We've been exploring the possibility, it's just another face of capitalism, but you know, the idea that was introduced to us at some point last year, that it would be possible, you know, to with a strong enough big idea to find sort of like venture capitalists who would invest money in that idea and would want to see some results, but where, you know, I mean, just in a way, I'm thinking about what Julie is saying, you know, an alternative to, like, say, like creating a product that is a source of kind of, you know, like of long-term income, like basically a grant system where, you know, you like hoe the idea up front to, like, you know, get somebody to finance it in exchange for some metric that they want to see. It's not any less capitalist, but, you know, in a way, it's just another like income stream idea.
Yeah, I mean, and in that way, it could be a kind of fellowship program,
right?
You know, that's still able to, so that folks can support themselves. Right. You know, that it just comes down to that at the end of the day. Yeah, and I don't know. It's really hard to negotiate these things. I don't know that there's any way to do it in a truly liberatory way, unless you say, like, okay, let's build this commune and come live here and work the land and you'll have all your needs covered. But folks have families and, you know, there's just so much. We do have another program in South Africa as part of our network, who does work with horticulture in prisons. They are called Hulumelelisa. I can send you all of these links, but and what I really liked about so they work in a couple prisons in the Joburg area and train individuals not only in horticulture, which is a viable, you know, and actually in South Africa and many other places, like, there's jobs in that industry. So that's a very good practical thing for when they come home. But also they tie in this whole life skills curriculum and sort of therapeutic aspect of horticulture, and they have gardens in the prisons. And what I really liked about their model is that all the instructors are formerly incarcerated themselves. So they're employing, you know, which is a great thing from a level of pedagogy, A, and B is great economically. So it's another kind of economic format where they're supporting, you know, they're paying salaries to these instructors and supporting them upon their release. So, and they're also thinking about trying to develop some kind of a food co-op on the outside.
Yeah, that seems
it's interesting. you
Go
know,
ahead.
listening to you talk about, you know, these more successful models of, you know, collectivization and 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 co-op building, you know, there seems to be a real kind of like, I guess like one of the real differences between like these non-US models and the US model is that there's a kind of like a temporal longevity built into the non-US model, right? So that it's, you know, okay, you learn these skills on the inside and then you teach them on the outside to the inside. So it's almost like this loop. And I couldn't help but thinking about, you know, your new project on intentional communities. I don't know if you know the Oneida community
I've been
in
researching
upstate New
them.
York, but they're, you know, it's like this amazing story where this guy, you know, they believed in Bible communism. They were extremely radical in their outlook in, you know, the middle of the 19th century. They, you know, they had a sort of like family model that went really wrong, and the founder of the community wound up being like, you know, had to flee the Oneida house in the dead of night. But they wound up surviving because a later generation of children that were the product of, you know, the sort of free love that they practiced came back and decided, okay, we need like some business. We need to engage in some kind of business. And they started producing flatware, which is, you know, that corporation like wound up sustaining the Oneida community even today, so that if you're a descendant of one of the members of the Oneida community, you still have, you will always have a home there, right? There's always a room for you in this giant house. So yeah, I wonder whether like these kinds of, you know, I think the work that that organizations like Prison to College Pipeline do is you become really good at getting around like the sort of absurdities of, you know, of the of the the carceral system, right? Which is not, which is really a mess. I think there was like one person that was in charge of the entire North Country, prisons in the North Country, education programs in all of the North Country, right? And we just had to deal with this one person, like who was in charge of like, you know, like this vast territory, which opens up a lot of like, I don't know what I'm trying to say, except that like, you know, I wonder if like, rather than thinking about like, you know, creating a kind of like, a model that fits within a system. So like you create a sort of a very sexy project that will appeal to a venture capitalist, and they'll invest, you know, in the project like for however many years, and then, you know, the project is over. To think about how to like leverage some of these things to creating these more long-term, durable, intergenerational solutions.
Definitely, and I think that that's really it's related to this idea of you know, of again, like that which begins on the inside must continue on the outside and beyond that. You know, that it's a constant, like it's a constant process. It's a constant, you know, there's a constant community that exists and is ongoing.
Boz, I know that you have a meeting and it's 6 o'clock now.
Yes, I let them know that I'm going to be a few minutes late, so we can chat a bit more.
Could I just ask about at the start, I imagine that you were actively involved in teaching in one or more prisons?
Mm-hmm.
Like, did it tend, I mean, was it around a specific prison at the start?
Yes, everything. So I taught in the program every single year since it started, and except for the 1 year that I was on sabbatical, and I was just coming back and forth. But we're at Otisville Correctional Facility, which is in Otisville, New York, and we were there only because that's where the Department of Corrections placed us. Really, they didn't have any college program, you know. So you often have to play with the departments of corrections to get things set up. But as we grew, what happened is that we started recruiting from other prisons. Another thing, I mean, it's like you sign a deal with the Department of Corrections, and you have to really work with them and do what they say. And so they'll let you recruit from this facility, but not this one. You have to deal with, because we would start recruiting all over the state, even though the teaching and the classes, everything happened in one prison, which is Otisville, because it's also relatively close proximity to New York City. So getting up there became reasonable. But they would also have a say over students if we want, because we'd have to transfer them from other prisons, and they have their requirements about what transfers are allowed and what wasn't. So, you really have to work closely with docs on this stuff. There's no way to do it without that. And how effective that goes, it depends. I mean, this is true about our system. It's very prison to prison. And it's not just in the US. I've seen this all over the world. Everything is like, the way things are done in one prison in the same exact state can be so different in another prison, depending on things like staff, whether there's an educational person there who really wants to do the work or not, and so on. So it's a big factor in thinking about doing that kind of work. Another agriculture program in prison that comes to mind is also in Italy. Also a capitalist enterprise, is kinder capitalism. And it's there's a wine label, Frescobaldi. It's a quite, prominent wine label, and they ended up starting a prison farm that is producing wine, and in this very therapeutic environment. It's an island off Tuscany called Gorgona. I visited it. It's and they pay the incarcerated workers, much better than they would get paid. They also had a commitment to hiring some of them when they came home. A lot of them, I mean, there were a lot of problematics of it. And again, I think anytime I visit a prison farm, I've seen a lot of them. It's impossible to not reckon with the history of, slavery and plantation slavery and prisons. And so it's tricky, even outside of the US, where there isn't necessarily that same legacy, but a lot of them did speak to me about what it was to work the land and experience the growth of a vine, and, and feel that and learn from it. And it is a viable skill as well, as certainly in Italy, when they come home. And then there was the commitment on the part of the company to hiring some of them. They also, for a brief time, had a project inside a prison in Milan where they were doing olive oil, and they were growing trees. But the prison, I think, got just sort of antsy about it and ended up canceling it. You're very much at the whim of these systems. If they feel like canceling you, they'll cancel you. So, it becomes tricky in that way. But they were interesting projects, and there was definitely, it wasn't just about, let me get some cheap prison labor.
Yeah. Well, we would love to have you up at Denison Hill sometime. I mean, we've been doing this, I don't know how many years, you guys, 15, 20 years almost. We've been in conversation for 20 years and been trying to really grow this space and place, and think of it very much as an intentional community. So come see us.
I would love that.
When
Definitely.
we be back together and continue the conversation. But this was really great to start this and have this with you again. Thank you so much for your time. It's like 5 after 6.
Oh, thank you.
I know you have.
My pleasure. Thank you guys. Good to see you, Julie, and nice to meet you both. And I hope that we can meet in person soon.
Yeah, me too.
I could use a porch in my life.
Yeah.
We have a good one.
Porch, wine. We don't have olive oil, but we make other things.
That's all good. Sounds good.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon, boss. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
you. Guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey, guys.
Cool, Julie.
All right.
Thank
You want to stop recording?
Yeah.